Income Tax 2020. Child and Dependent Care Tax Credits. Come in, relax with Income Tax 2020. Child and Dependent Care Tax Credits. When thinking about the income tax equation, we're going to be in the bottom half of the income tax equation now in the taxes and payments section, remembering that we can break the income tax equation into basically two halves, the top half then being a modified income statement, the second half then being the calculation of the tax, then application of the payments and the credits to get to the bottom line, that being the tax refund or the amount due. That's what we're going to be focusing in down here in the credits area, which could be credits here and credits here. That's due to having refundable tax credits and non-refundable tax credits that we will talk about in a second. Also, remember that the credits are going to be different than deductions. They're both basically good for taxes, but the credits, if you talk about $1 of credit versus $1 of a deduction, the credit will be worth more because you're getting that full dollar's worth of basically money back or the reduction of the tax. Whereas if you talk about $1 of deduction, then you're only getting a deduction in relation to the amount of the tax rates that are being applied to it. So remember, we have the above the line deductions we talked about before, the adjustments to income, then the greater of the standard or itemized deductions. Those are deductions to get us down to basically taxable income, which is kind of like net income. Then we calculate the tax. And then you would think at this point, you would just say, okay, now we decide how much was paid in, how much was withheld from our W-2s, for example, and that should then get us to the refund or amount due. But we have this added complication where they put credits down here, credits not being deduction, not just lowering our income, but actually being a dollar for dollar tax back. That's why it's going to be similar to a payment, and that's why they group them together like in the payments down here. So credits, of course, are going to be important ones. The two big credits that affect many different people and also are called the refundable credits, making them a bit more complicated to calculate, are going to be the child tax credit and the earned income credit. Those are the two big kind of refundable credits. That's why we have these two categories up top, the tax credits and other taxes, and then the tax payments and refundable credits. We need that so that we can break out what is refundable and not. What does refundable mean? Refundable means that you could get money back even though you didn't put money in, meaning it's not really a tax. It's more of like a welfare program or a benefit type of program because you're not paying taxes at that point. You're getting money back even though you didn't put money in. So these ones up top would be taking us down to zero. You would think that's what the credit would do if you were talking about an income tax, meaning the credit could go taking the liability down to zero, but not below zero. The refundable credits actually do take the tax below zero, and then you can actually get a refund even if you didn't put any money in, even if you didn't owe anything or put any money in. And the child tax credit does fit within that category. That's where our focus will be. So the child tax credit, and this is the second page of the 1040, will have an effect there. We'll take a look at the greater example of the actual tax forms in the following presentation when we look at this in the tax software. But you'll see here we have the child tax credit or credit for the other dependents. We have the amount up top at the $1,138, bringing the tax down to zero. And then we have this added amount down below, which is the additional child tax credit. Now note that we're not currently calculating with this tax return the earned income credit, which could complicate things with the relationship between the child tax credit being refundable and the earned income credit. But just note we're focusing in on the child tax credit here, and we could have those two components of the child tax credit, one calculated basically up top here, and then the refundable portion being calculated on down below. So then we could find some information, of course, on the IRS website. They have a nice interview process, which we might go through a couple of examples of either in this presentation or a future one. You can find it by going to the irs.gov website, irs.gov, typing in, does my child dependent qualify for the child tax credit or the credit for other dependents? And you can begin the process down here, and that'll take you through kind of like an interview process that will help you to work through that, and you got a question and answer kind of thing, and we may take a look at that shortly. Now note that a lot of this information, although the forms are out for 2020, and when we do the tax software, we'll take a look at those. Some of the publications have not yet been updated for 2020, so we're going to be starting from the publication 972 for 2019 and then make adjustments to it where we think applicable, but just realize that the information is first coming from the 2019 instructions and then we make adjustments to them. If you have any questions and want to drill down on this in more depth, then you can go to the IRS website, take a look at publication 972 is a good place to start your research. And the 2020 information should be out shortly. This is the child tax credit and credit for other dependents. Notice that these two things are often linked together, the child tax credit and credit for other dependents, because when you think about your benefit that you might get possibly from having a dependent, most likely, then the first one you would like to get, because it would be a higher benefit, would be a qualifying child, a child tax credit. So that's the one you look at first. If you can't get that one, then you move on to the other dependents. So that's how you want to think about this. If someone has a dependent, first, does someone qualify as a dependent? If they are a dependent, then do they help to qualify for a child tax credit, which would be the biggest benefit in terms of credits? And then if not, do they qualify for an other dependents credits? That's your thought process. Let's start off with the child tax credit, sometimes abbreviated as the CTC. This credit is for individuals who claim a child as a dependent if the child meets additional conditions described later. It is in addition to the credit for child and dependent care expenses and the earned income credit. The maximum amount you can claim for the credit is $2,000 for each child who qualifies you for the CTC, child tax credit, but you could have limitations on the CTC and ODC, and we may look at that in more detail later. But typically, you're thinking $2,000 for the child tax credit per qualifying dependent, qualifying then child. So qualifying child for the CTC, child tax credit. A child qualifies for the CTC, child tax credit, if the child meets all the following conditions. So what are the conditions? 1, the child is your son, daughter, stepchild, eligible foster child, brother, sister, stepbrother, stepsister, half-brother, half-sister, or descendant of any of them, for example, your grandchild, niece, or nephew. And 2, the child was under age 17 at the end of the tax year. Remember that this 17 is applicable specifically to whether they are going to be a qualifying child for the child tax credit. It's not whether or not they're going to be a dependent at all. So you could have other age limits such as 19, or if they're a student up to like 24 or something like that. This 17 then isn't the determining factor as to whether they're going to be a dependent. It's a determining factor as to whether they qualify for a qualifying child with regards to the child tax credit. So 3, the child did not provide over half his or her own support for the tax year. 4, the child lived with you for more than half of the tax year. You can see exceptions to time lived with you later, so you might have some exceptions in that situation. You could have like joint custody kind of situations where you might want to dive a little bit more into more detail there. 5, the child is claiming as a dependent on your return. So they're a dependent on your return. You can see publication 501 for more information about claiming someone as a dependent. So we talked about dependents in a prior presentation. So 6, the child does not file a joint return for the year or files it only to claim a refund of withheld income tax or estimated tax paid. So if they file a joint return, that would mean they're married, and you would think if they're married, they wouldn't be a qualifying child on your return, but possibly there's this exception here that you could take into consideration under unusual circumstances. And then 7, the child was a U.S. citizen, U.S. national, or U.S. resident alien. For more information there, you can see publication 519. So if they don't qualify then for the CTC, qualified tax credit, then you go on to the ODC, which is the credit for other dependents. So credit for other dependents or other dependents credit. This credit for individuals with a dependent who meets additional conditions described later. This credit is in addition to the credit for the child and dependent care expenses. So we're not talking about in addition to the child tax credit, but the child and dependent care expenses. And the earned income credit, the maximum amount you can claim for the credit is $500 for each dependent who qualifies for an ODC, an other dependent credit. But see limitations to the CTC and ODC later. You could have limitations on that. So notice this is a $500, so you can, per qualifying dependent then, you can either have one or the other. You can't take both the ODC and the CDC, the credit for other dependents and the child tax credit. So you first see if you can get up to that $2,000 amount, and if not, then you move on to see if you can get the ODC or the other dependent credit here. So qualified person for other dependent credit, a person qualifies you for the ODC, other dependent credit, if the person meets all of the following conditions. And again, you first looked into the child tax credit, because if they qualify as a qualifying child, that's going to be one thing that's going to disqualify them typically for the ODC, because you're going to get the bigger credit, most likely, of the child tax credit in that situation. So 1, the person is claimed as a dependent on your return. See publication 501 for more information about claiming someone as a dependent. We talked about claiming someone as a dependent in a prior presentation, so you can take a look at that. And then the person cannot be used by you to claim the CTC or ACTC, see child tax credit earlier. So notice one of the things that has to be here for the ODC is that they're not a qualifying child, meaning you didn't take the CTC, the child tax credit. You can't take both. And then we have 3, the person was a U.S. citizen, U.S. national, U.S. resident alien. For more information, you can see publication 519. If the person is your adopted child, you can also see the adopted child earlier. Now, if you got some items that are in a gray area, or if you have like clients that are, want to test this out on themselves, then you can direct people to the IRS website at irs.gov, irs.gov, and they can search there. Does my child/dependent qualify for the child tax credit or the credit for other dependents? And you should get to this page, which we may take a look at in a following presentation, and you can go through kind of this interview process, and that can be a process that'll make it a little bit easier to make that determination.